A 68-year-old janitor spent his last $50 on a condemned, rotting mansion slated for demolition. Everyone called him a fool until he tore down a crumbling basement wall and found a hidden vault. What lay inside didn't just change his life, it rewrote the dark history of an entire town. Samuel Higgins had spent 42 years making other people's floors shine. As the head custodian at Oakhaven Public High School, his life was measured in gallons of industrial bleach, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, and a pension that barely covered the cost of his arthritis medication. When he was forced into retirement at 68, Samuel found himself facing a terrifying reality. He had less than $1,000 to his name, and his landlord had just doubled the rent on his cramped, one-bedroom apartment. With nowhere else to go, Samuel sought refuge from the biting November rain in the back row of the Oakhaven County Courthouse. They were holding the annual tax default property auction. He wasn't there to buy. He was there because the courthouse radiators pumped out a ferocious, comforting heat. At the front of the room, Gregory Mitchell, the county auctioneer, was sweating through his suit, trying to offload derelict properties to a room full of bored contractors and cynical real estate flippers. Next up, Parcel 402, the old Harrington estate, Gregory announced, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. A murmur of dry laughter rippled through the gallery. Everyone in Oakhaven knew the Harrington estate. Built in 1912 by William Harrington, a ruthless steel baron, the sprawling three-story Victorian mansion sat on a bluff overlooking the town. But William Harrington had died bankrupt and disgraced in the late 1980s. Since then, the estate had been abandoned to the elements. The roof was caved in, the windows were shattered, and the foundation was slowly sinking into the muddy hillside. Worse than the physical decay was the legal nightmare attached to it. The county had condemned the building. Whoever bought it would be legally mandated to pay for an environmental lead and asbestos abatement, followed by a mandatory demolition. The estimated cost of tearing the house down was nearly $100,000. The county was desperate to get the liability off their books, so they set the opening bid at a humiliatingly low price. "We have a starting bid of $50, Gregory droned, leaning on his podium. $50 for the Harrington property. Do I hear 50? Silence. The contractors checked their phones. The investors coughed. Samuel sat in the back row, rubbing his aching knees. He didn't have $100,000 to demolish a mansion. But Samuel knew something the hotshot investors didn't. He had spent his evenings reading through the municipal bylaws at the public library, looking for any loophole that might keep a roof over his head. According to a forgotten 1942 Oakhaven municipal code, if a citizen purchased a condemned residential property and legally declared it their primary domicile within 24 hours, the county was forced to grant a 5-year grace period on all demolition orders to prevent the new homeowner from becoming a ward of the state. It was a crazy, desperate thought. But the alternative was sleeping in his rusty 1998 sedan. Samuel slowly raised his battered yellow bidding paddle. The room went dead silent. Heads swiveled. Gregory Mitchell blinked, adjusting his glasses to peer through the dim lighting of the courthouse. "I have a bid in the back," Gregory said, his voice laced with disbelief. $50 from Mr. Higgins. Are you sure, Samuel? You know the stipulations attached to this parcel." "I know 'em," Samuel said, his voice raspy from years of inhaling cleaning chemicals. $50. Going once, Gregory said hurriedly, eager to seal the deal before the old man came to his senses. "Going twice. Sold. For $50. The bang of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. Samuel walked to the clerk's desk, pulled 2 crumpled $20 bills, and a 10 from his worn leather wallet, and traded them for the deed to a nightmare. By nightfall, Samuel was standing in the grand foyer of the Harrington estate. It was worse than he had imagined. The air was thick with the smell of wet rot and raccoon droppings. The grand mahogany staircase, once the centerpiece of elite high society galas, was scarred and splintered. Tattered strips of silk wallpaper hung like dead skin from the walls. He set up a small camping lantern and a cot in the old parlor, the only room where the ceiling didn't look ready to cave in immediately. As the wind howled through the broken window panes, Samuel wrapped himself in 3 wool blankets and stared at the shadows dancing on the wall. He was the master of a ruined castle. The next morning, Samuel did the only thing he knew how to do. He started cleaning. Armed with a heavy-duty push broom, a crowbar, and heavy leather gloves, he began clearing the debris. He didn't have the money to fix the plumbing or the electricity, but he could at least make the ground floor habitable. For 3 weeks, Samuel worked from dawn until dusk, hauling rotting furniture, broken glass, and fallen plaster out to the overgrown front yard. It was during the 4th week that Samuel turned his attention to the basement. The basement was a massive, cavernous space, smelling heavily of coal dust and damp earth. Armed with a flashlight, Samuel began pulling away rotting crates and rusted tin cans left over from the Cold War. As he cleared the back wall near the old, defunct coal chute, he noticed something strange about the masonry. Samuel had spent decades repairing brickwork at the high school. He knew how mortar aged. The bricks surrounding the coal chute were dark, crumbling, and covered in a century of grime. But a large rectangular section of the wall, about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, looked subtly different. The mortar was a slightly lighter shade of grey, and the alignment of the bricks was off by just a fraction of an inch. It was a patch job, an incredibly skilled patch job, designed to blend in with the original foundation, but a patch nonetheless. Curiosity overrode his exhaustion. Samuel gripped his heavy steel crowbar, wedged the flat end into a crack in the suspect mortar, and threw his weight against it. The mortar cracked with a sharp snap. A shower of dust rained down onto his boots. Breathing heavily, Samuel struck the brick again and then again. His shoulders burned, and his arthritic joints screamed in protest. But the thrill of the mystery drove him forward. After 20 minutes of grueling labor, a single brick came loose and tumbled to the concrete floor. Samuel aimed his flashlight into the dark void behind the brick. The beam of light reflected off something cold, flat, and undeniably metallic. It wasn't just a patched wall. It was a tomb, and Samuel had just found the door. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He spent the next 12 hours systematically dismantling the false brick wall. With every swing of the crowbar, a piece of the Harrington family's carefully constructed facade chipped away, revealing the massive structure hidden beneath the masonry. By dawn, Samuel stood back, panting, his face streaked with sweat and grey dust. Before him was a solid steel vault door. It was a magnificent, terrifying piece of engineering, utterly out of place in a damp residential basement. It stood 7 feet tall, painted in a faded, military-grade olive drab. At the center of the heavy steel plate was a large, polished brass combination dial, oxidized green with age, and a heavy lever handle. Above the dial, a tarnished manufacturer's plate read, Mosler Safe Company. Custom installation, 1954. Samuel wiped his hands on his overalls and stepped closer. He placed his calloused fingers on the brass dial and gave it a tentative spin. It moved smoothly, a testament to the high-quality bearings hidden within the locking mechanism. But Samuel was a retired janitor, not a safe cracker. There were millions of possible combinations. He couldn't drill it. He didn't even have electricity, let alone diamond-tipped drill bits. He couldn't blow it open. He had to figure out the code. Leaving the basement, Samuel locked the heavy front doors of the mansion and drove his battered sedan into downtown Oakhaven. He parked in front of the Oakhaven Public Library, a brick building he had cleaned for a few summers back in the 1990s. Inside, he found Evelyn Cross, the head archivist. Evelyn was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who knew the history of Oakhaven better than anyone alive. "Samuel," Evelyn said warmly, looking up from her desk, "I heard you bought the Harrington place. Half the town thinks you've lost your mind. The other half thinks you're going to die of tetanus." "I might just prove both halves right," Samuel chuckled, though his eyes were deadly serious. "Evelyn, I need to know everything you have on William Harrington, specifically around the year 1954. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. 1954? That was a dark year for the Harringtons. Why the sudden interest? "Just trying to understand the history of my new home," Samuel deflected smoothly. Evelyn led him to the microfiche machines in the back room and pulled several dusty boxes of local archives. For the next 5 hours, Samuel scrolled through faded newspaper clippings, societal columns, and financial records. William Harrington had been a tyrant of a man, building his wealth on the backs of underpaid steel workers. But in 1954, his empire had suffered a bizarre and sudden contraction. He had sold off 3 major factories in a panic. But what caught Samuel's eye was a front-page article from the Oakhaven Tribune, dated November 4th, 1954. The headline read, "Harrington Heiress Disappears Along with Company Funds." The article detailed how William's only daughter, a rebellious 22-year-old named Margaret, had vanished without a trace. On the exact same night, over $2 million in company bearer bonds and gold certificates went missing from the corporate safe. William had accused his daughter of embezzlement, but she was never found. The scandal had laid the groundwork for the eventual collapse of the Harrington Empire decades later. Samuel stared at the date on the newspaper, November 4th, 1954. In his experience, arrogant men rarely relied on random numbers. They used dates of significance, dates of deep emotional trauma or triumph. Samuel thanked Evelyn, rushed to his car, and sped back to the mansion. By the time he descended into the basement, his heart was hammering against his ribs. He stood before the Mosler vault door, his breath visible in the chilly, damp air. He reached out and grasped the cold brass dial. 11. He spun the dial right to the number 11. 04. He reversed it, spinning left to 04. 54. He spun it right again, stopping dead on 54. Samuel held his breath and grabbed the heavy lever handle. He pushed down with all his might. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then from deep within the thick steel door, a heavy metallic clack echoed through the basement. The locking bolts had retracted. Samuel pulled. The door, despite weighing nearly a ton, swung outward on perfectly balanced hinges, exhaling a rush of stale, bone-dry air that smelled of old paper and leather. Samuel clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight and stepped across the threshold. The vault was roughly the size of a small bedroom. The walls were lined with custom-built mahogany shelving, perfectly preserved in the airtight environment. But it wasn't the shelving that made Samuel drop to his knees. Stacked on the shelves were neat, tightly banded bundles of paper. Samuel picked one up, his hands trembling. They were 1928 gold certificates in denominations of $1,000. There were dozens of bundles. Next to them lay the missing corporate bearer bonds from 1954. Samuel had just found the missing Harrington fortune. Adjusted for inflation, he was looking at a vault containing nearly $20 million in untraceable liquid assets. But as Samuel's flashlight swept across the room, the beam caught something else. Sitting alone on a small metal table in the center of the vault was a thick, leather-bound ledger book, secured with a heavy brass clasp. Samuel set the bundles of cash down. The money was incredible, but the ledger felt dangerous. He unclasped the book and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was tight and aggressive, undoubtedly William Harrington's. It wasn't an accounting book. It was a blackmail ledger. Samuel's eyes widened as he read the first entry. It detailed a massive payoff made to a local union boss to break a strike in 1953, resulting in the accidental deaths of 3 workers. He turned the page. The next entry documented a scheme to embezzle municipal funds, orchestrated by Harrington and the former town treasurer. But it was the third entry that made the blood freeze in Samuel's veins. It was a detailed account of a land theft operation involving the current, highly respected mayor of Oakhaven, Jonathan Reed, or rather, Mayor Reed's father, who had passed the corrupt empire down to his son. The ledger contained maps, signed confessions, and irrefutable proof that half the town's current elite had built their fortunes on murder and theft. This wasn't just a treasure vault. It was a loaded gun pointed at the most powerful people in Oakhaven. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the floor above. Samuel froze. The heavy, unmistakable crunch of tires on the gravel driveway outside. He switched off his flashlight, plunging the vault into pitch blackness. He crept to the edge of the steel door and strained to listen. Above him, on the first floor, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion creaked open. "Hello?" A deep, authoritative voice called out. "Mr. Higgins, we know you're in here." Heavy footsteps began to, slowly, methodically, walk across the ruined floorboards, heading straight for the basement stairs. The heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the basement stairs echoed like a death knell in the cavernous underground space. Samuel Higgins held his breath, pressing his back against the cold steel interior of the Mosler vault. He gripped the heavy brass clasp of the blackmail ledger to his chest, his knuckles white. Out in the basement, the sweep of a high-powered tactical flashlight sliced through the darkness, casting long, monstrous shadows across the damp brick walls. "Check the corners, Boyd," the authoritative voice commanded. "If the old man is down here, I want him on his knees before he knows what hit him." Samuel recognized that voice immediately. It belonged to Montgomery Keller, the chief of police for Oakhaven. For the past 15 years, Keller had been the primary enforcer for Mayor Jonathan Reed, operating a police department that functioned more like a private security firm for the town's elite. "Looks like he's been knocking down walls, Chief," Boyd, a massive, thick-necked deputy, muttered. The beam of the flashlight settled on the pile of broken masonry and the gaping hole where the false wall had once stood. "Well, well, well," Keller murmured, his voice dripping with sinister amusement as he stepped into the light. He was a tall, angular man in a tailored trench coat, holding a suppressed semi-automatic pistol in his right hand. The legend was true. The Harrington Vault. Mayor Reed's father always swore William Harrington built a panic room down here before the feds started snooping around his steel mills. Keller stepped closer to the open vault door, tracing the faded olive paint with his free hand. Samuel squeezed himself deeper into the shadows, behind the towering mahogany shelves, clutching the ledger. He knew exactly why the chief of police was here. The property auction had just been a formality, a way for the city to legally possess the mansion so they could tear it down and bury Harrington's secrets forever. Samuel's $50 bid had thrown a massive wrench into a decades-old cover-up. "Higgins!" Keller shouted, his voice echoing violently off the basement walls. "I know you're in there. There's only one way out of that vault, and I'm standing right in front of it. Walk out with your hands empty, and maybe we let you pack your bags and leave Oakhaven in one piece. You're out of your depth, old man. This doesn't concern you." Samuel remained perfectly still, a bead of cold sweat tracing a path down his weathered cheek. His mind raced. He had no weapon. He had a bad knee, arthritic hands, and a body that had endured nearly 7 decades of back-breaking labor. But he also had the ultimate advantage: absolute darkness, and a lifetime of knowing how to navigate the unseen corners of a building. He knew how spaces worked, how heavy doors swung, and how arrogance made powerful men blind. "Go in and drag him out," Keller ordered Boyd, stepping back and raising his pistol. Boyd clicked on his flashlight, the blinding white beam piercing the threshold of the vault. He stepped heavily over the steel sill, his boots thumping against the polished concrete floor of the safe. The beam swept across the neat stacks of gold certificates and bearer bonds. Boyd let out a low whistle. "Chief, you gotta see this," Boyd breathed, his greed momentarily overriding his caution. "There's millions here. Cash, bonds. It's a gold mine." "Forget the money for a second, you idiot," Keller snapped, stepping partially into the vault doorway, drawn by the allure of the fortune. "Find the ledger. Reed said there was a book. Find it, and find the janitor." As Keller's attention drifted toward the shelves on the left side of the room, Samuel made his move. He didn't hesitate, and he didn't stumble. Moving with a silent, fluid grace born of desperate adrenaline, Samuel slipped from behind the right-hand shelving unit. He didn't run toward the men. He lunged directly for the heavy lever handle on the inside of the vault door. Boyd swung his flashlight around, catching Samuel in the blinding beam. "Hey, shoot him!" Keller roared, raising his weapon. But Samuel was already moving. He grabbed the internal release handle of the massive steel door and threw his entire body weight backward, using his legs to pivot the ton of steel on its perfectly oiled hinges. The door swung inward with terrifying speed. Keller realized what was happening a fraction of a second too late. He lunged backward to avoid being crushed by the closing door, tumbling out into the main basement. Boyd, trapped inside the vault, lunged forward, his hands grasping desperately at the closing gap. With a deafening, thunderous clang, the steel door slammed shut, missing Boyd's fingers by millimeters. Samuel didn't stop. He was on the outside now, standing in the basement with a stunned Keller on the floor. Before the chief of police could raise his weapon, Samuel grabbed the massive exterior lever of the Mosler safe, hauled it upward, and spun the brass dial violently to the right. The heavy locking bolts fired into place with a mechanical, bone-rattling thud. Boyd was locked inside the airtight, soundproof tomb. Keller scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in absolute fury. He leveled the suppressed pistol directly at Samuel's chest. "You stupid old fool! Open that door! Open it right now, or I swear I will put a bullet in your heart." Samuel stood his ground, the heavy leather ledger tucked firmly under his arm. He stared down the barrel of the gun, his heart pounding like a jackhammer, but his voice was remarkably steady. "You shoot me, Keller, and your deputy suffocates in there. That's a 1954 Mosler custom build, airtight. He has maybe 6 hours of oxygen. The combination is randomized now. Only I know the sequence to reset it. Keller froze. The chief of police was a ruthless man, but explaining the suffocation of his own deputy inside an illegal vault would bring down the wrath of the state police. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. Furthermore, Samuel continued, his confidence surging, if I don't walk out of here tonight, this ledger goes directly to the state attorney general. You think I've been sitting here doing nothing? I've already mailed photocopies of the first 10 pages to a very secure location. You shoot me, and Mayor Reed's entire empire burns to the ground by Tuesday. It was a complete and utter bluff, but Samuel delivered it with the iron conviction of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Keller's eyes darted from Samuel to the locked vault door, then to the ledger tucked under the old man's arm. The power dynamic had violently shifted. The arrogant police chief was suddenly trapped in a checkmate orchestrated by a retired school janitor. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Higgins, Keller spat, slowly lowering the weapon. You can't hide from us. Reed owns this county. He owns the judges, the banks, the roads. You take that book, and you are a dead man walking. I survived 40 years, cleaning up after ungrateful children, Chief, Samuel said, walking slowly backward toward the basement stairs. I think I can handle a few corrupt politicians. Now, I'm going to walk out of here. If you follow me, I throw the combination away, and Boyd dies in the dark. Keller stood frozen in the beam of his dropped flashlight, seething with impotent rage as he listened to Samuel Higgins ascend the wooden stairs, walk out the front door of the mansion, and drive off into the freezing November night. Samuel didn't drive to his apartment. He knew Keller's men would be waiting there. He didn't go to the local precinct, nor did he stop at the county courthouse. He merged onto the interstate and drove straight through the night, pushing his rusting 1998 sedan to its absolute limits until the sun began to rise over the state capital, 300 miles away from the venomous reach of Oakhaven. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, Samuel walked into the towering glass and steel headquarters of the State Attorney General's office. He bypassed the reception desk, ignoring the protests of the security guards, and demanded to speak directly with Penelope Vargas, the notoriously aggressive state prosecutor known for dismantling organized crime rings. It took 30 minutes of arguing, but when Samuel slid the heavy, leather-bound Harrington ledger across a polished mahogany conference table, Vargas finally paid attention. For the next 4 hours, Penelope Vargas and her team of forensic accountants pored over the meticulous, damning handwriting of William Harrington. They cross-referenced the dates, the bank accounts, and the names. The ledger was a perfect map of systematic corruption spanning 3 generations. It outlined exactly how Mayor Jonathan Reed's family had stolen municipal land, funneled city pensions into offshore accounts, and orchestrated the quiet disappearances of whistleblowers throughout the 1970s and 80s. Mr. Higgins, Vargas said, taking off her reading glasses and rubbing her temples. She looked at the retired janitor with a mixture of shock and profound respect. Do you have any idea what you've handed me? This isn't just a smoking gun. This is the entire artillery battery. This book gives us the probable cause to tear Oakhaven's local government out by the roots. I want 2 things in return, Samuel stated, sitting perfectly straight in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. Vargas raised an eyebrow. Name them. First, I want full immunity for anything regarding the Harrington estate. Second, the vault contains millions in 1928 gold certificates and unregistered bearer bonds. I bought the property and everything on it for $50 in a legal county auction. I want a binding legal decree from the state acknowledging that the contents of that vault are my lawful property. No civil asset forfeiture, no police seizures. Vargas smiled, a sharp, predatory grin. Done. In fact, we'll assign a state police tactical unit to escort you back to Oakhaven to secure your property while we arrest the mayor. You've done the state a massive favor today, Samuel. We can let you keep the gold. The raid on Oakhaven happened 48 hours later, and it was a spectacle the town would never forget. A convoy of unmarked black SUVs and heavily armored state police vehicles descended upon the town just before dawn. Mayor Jonathan Reed was arrested in his pajamas, dragged out of his luxury townhouse in handcuffs while local news helicopters circled overhead. Chief Montgomery Keller was apprehended at the local precinct, his badge stripped from his chest as federal agents seized all department records. Boyd, the deputy, had been rescued from the vault hours after Samuel's escape, only to be slapped in irons the moment the state troopers arrived. The entire power structure of Oakhaven collapsed in a single morning. Decades of stolen land was seized, frozen pensions were returned to the municipal workers, and a dozen high-ranking officials were indicted on federal racketeering charges. As for Samuel Higgins, he walked back through the shattered front doors of the Harrington estate. But this time, he wasn't alone. He was flanked by armored guards from a private security firm, hired to transport the contents of the Mosler vault to a high-security federal depository. When the bank finally tallied the staggering haul, the bearer bonds and the pristine, uncirculated gold certificates amounted to a staggering $22 million. Samuel Higgins, the man who had spent 42 years mopping floors and emptying trash cans for minimum wage, was suddenly the wealthiest man in the county. But Samuel didn't buy a yacht. He didn't move to a tropical island or buy a fleet of sports cars. Instead, he hired a massive team of historical restoration architects, structural engineers, and master carpenters. He poured millions into the Harrington estate, replacing the rotting roof with imported slate, rebuilding the grand mahogany staircase by hand, and restoring the sprawling gardens to their former 1912 glory. The town watched in awe as the terrifying, condemned mansion on the hill transformed into a breathtaking architectural masterpiece. A year later, the gates of the estate were finally opened to the public. Samuel had legally transferred the deed to a non-profit trust, turning the mansion into the Oakhaven Public Library and Community Center. The massive basement, once a tomb of dark secrets and stolen wealth, was completely renovated into a state-of-the-art computer lab and after-school facility for the town's underprivileged youth. On the day of the grand opening, Samuel stood in the beautifully restored parlor, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored suit that finally fit his frame. He watched children run across the polished hardwood floors he had once been hired to sweep, and smiled. He had bought a nightmare for $50, and in the end, he had transformed it into a legacy that no corrupt politician could ever tear down. The old janitor had finally cleaned up the town, once and for all. What an incredible conclusion to the Harrington estate mystery. Samuel didn't just find $20 million in hidden treasure. He single-handedly took down a corrupt empire and gave his town the ultimate gift. If this gripping, real-life drama kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share the video to help our channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another incredible hidden treasure story. See you next time.